Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, friends and colleagues. Thank you very much for turning out at this hour on a Friday afternoon on a very cold week. But we're here to celebrate World Water Day, and the UN has designated this day, so all around the world people are thinking about issues around water. And it's an opportunity for us to think about how important water is to all our lives, and what a lot of issues there are around the world, ranging from people in some of the poorest countries of the world who spend many hours a day simply fetching water for their families, or even suffering severe privation with drought, to the developed societies of the world, which nevertheless still face some really serious challenges around water. So it's an opportunity to recognize those important issues, but also it's an opportunity for us at the university to celebrate the work that we're doing to help society to move forward to meet some of these challenges. And one of the reasons that I'm here in Canada is that the University of Saskatchewan and our colleagues, Environment Canada, Agriculture Canada, and so on, based in Saskatoon, represent one of the most significant concentrations of expertise in water. So tonight's an opportunity to tell you a little bit about some of the work that's going on here in the context of some of the challenges that we face in Western Canada. So let me start off by reminding you what you already know, I think, that water is something that underlies all our lives. We wouldn't survive for more than 3 days without it. But also it underpins many aspects of society. So we have a lady from Bangladesh, one of the poor people of the world whose life is a struggle to obtain water for their families. We recognize that irrigation is central to feeding the world, but actually it consumes 80% of the world's water consumption. We remember that water is intimately associated with energy, both through hydropower generation, but also the world's thermal power stations could not survive without water for cooling. We need water for industry, and that means different things in different places. So in Saskatchewan, it's oil and gas development, potash, and so on. And a use that we sometimes forget about is that we, as a society, use water to dispose of many of our wastes. And so we're seeing increasing pressures on water quality. And then the last picture here, water that we need for the environment. And the way in which we value environmental use of water is a very interesting area. It's an issue in which societies at different stages of their development take very different views. But water is one of environmental water is one of the most important drivers for the future of water resource development. So, water and its use is interconnected between different sectors of society, and it's important to bear that complexity in mind. We hear quite a lot of fairly simplified discussion about things like the water-energy nexus or water-food-energy nexus, but any water manager will tell you that life is much more complex than that, and the interdependencies are very great. When we look around the world, we see a series of challenges. So the Aral Sea is probably familiar to most of you, and the story there is, of course, under the former Soviet Union, massive diversion of water from the tributaries of the Aral Sea for large-scale cotton irrigation, leading to the sea becoming a desert. When I arrived in Canada 2.5 years ago, then Pakistan was experiencing these massive floods. 20 million people displaced, 12 million people in need of emergency support. And scarcely a week or month goes by without a flooding issue. We mustn't also forget the water quality dimensions. Many of you will be aware of the work that's gone on here, the really important work that's gone on here with Ingrid Pickering and Graham George looking at arsenic in water in Bangladesh, causing severe illness, carcinomas to a population of some 70 million people. And it's tendency for us perhaps to look at these distant parts of the world and think that, well, we're all right. But, the US had its awakenings. So the Texas drought, part of a long-running drought in the southwestern the United States, with very severe implications for the local agricultural community, local societies, and also with effects on regional and global food prices. And then New York underwater in the end of last year. And we have our challenges here, and we'll talk about some of those later. But one of the ones that's very salutary, I think, is Lake Winnipeg. So Lake Winnipeg in 2007 had an algal bloom that was 15,000 square kilometers. So the lake seen from space turned bright green. And there are a whole series of issues around water quality, and particularly the amount of nutrients that we as a society put into our water systems, and the effects on, in this case, one of the world's top 10 lakes in terms, freshwater lakes in terms of size. So there's a whole series of challenges, both nationally, locally, nationally, and globally, but they're increasingly connected. So this is a diagram from a colleague of mine, Ignacio Rodriguez-Iturbi, looking at the global trade in virtual water, so the amount of water that we move around in food products. And in fact, there are societies like Israel and Egypt which rely for their basic food supplies on imported water through food. And then there are other kinds of connections too. So again, going back to 2010, ancient history maybe now, but the Russian heat wave, so reported to be the hottest event in Moscow in a millennium, with a major effect on the world's wheat production. And so, according to The Economist in 2012, the hike in food prices associated with that event is arguably one of the triggers behind the huge political changes that have taken place in the Middle East and North Africa with the Arab Spring. So water is under pressure worldwide. We have our issues locally, but we live in a connected world. So just to summarize some of the global water challenges, most places that I know and have worked in around the world use water unsustainably. And even in the UK, highly regulated, about 80% of England is over-licensed in terms of its water allocations. And so the Aral Sea is one example, but there are many others of decreasing groundwater levels, loss of wetlands, and reduced river flows. And one of the consequences of these pressures is competition for water resources in all its dimensions. Remember the first slide. And that competition can take place at a local level. In the case of Saskatchewan, do we put water into irrigation? Do we put it into potash mines? How do we secure our futures? But also, we have competition across boundaries. So is Alberta going to give Saskatchewan enough water this year? Some of those relationships are benign, and others are much more fraught. So at the international level, then there are really significant challenges between upstream and downstream users. And some of you will know that I'm involved in an arbitration between India and Pakistan concerning waters of on the Indus. So two nations that have actually been at war, but sitting around a table to mutually discuss the future of their water resources. And just to repeat, that the water story is as much about quality as it is about quantity. And we see significant pressures on water quality around the world. In the context of developing countries, there are still some gross problems, and I'm not sure how many of you caught the press last week about 12,000 dead pigs floating down through Shanghai. In the developed economies, we've pretty much been able to control end-of-pipe pollution, but we have some much more subtle and challenging issues around diffuse pollution. Some of those associated with nutrients, others, for example, some of the chemicals that we flush into the environment. And what we see also around the world is increasing flood and drought risk. That's partly, perhaps mainly due to the fact that we have more people and more assets in vulnerable situations, but also perhaps to increasing frequency of extreme events. So there's a lot of challenges, and if we look to the future, well, we see more challenges. So we have more people, those people will need more food. The FAO projects that by 2050 we'll need to double world food production. And of course that has water implications. As people get richer, they use more water, they use actually more water-intensive foods, and of course they need more energy. And the other context is a context of environmental change, and there are really two dimensions of that. One is land use and land management change. That can be intensive change with increasingly the world's population living in major urban centers, or it can be very extensive change. Think about the changes that have taken place to the prairies over the last century, for example. But the other big and relatively uncertain factor is the issue of changing climate. And Canada is, as we all know, right at the forefront of the impacts of climate change. And the startling statistics coming out over the last year about Arctic sea ice. And of course, there are complex feedbacks. So warmer winters in Western Canada means bark beetle and devastation to forests in British Columbia, but a problem that's marching progressively eastwards across Canada. So, where does that leave us? Well, it means that we have to make some difficult decisions. We can no longer keep on inexorably increasing our demand for water. We have to manage that. We have to think about more sustainable solutions in terms of water quantity and quality and address those rather difficult transboundary issues. And we have to recognize that the future is both complex and uncertain, and that will cause us to perhaps think in different ways about how we manage our futures and to decide perhaps what futures it is that we want to manage our way towards. So we put all this together, and that's a lot of challenges for society, but it also needs a lot of underpinning science to address those challenges. And one of the central aspects of our mission here in the Global Institute for Water Security is recognizing that we can no longer continue with individual disciplines ploughing their own path. We actually have such complex problems that we need to work together across the sciences and the social sciences and engineering to come up with integrated analyses and integrated solutions and improved tools to help society make those difficult decisions. And so a really important part of the agenda is producing not just data through our science and understanding, but also information that's going to be useful for society to manage its way through these problems. So in a sense, that's a backdrop for our Global Institute for Water Security, and we're just about on the second anniversary of the Global Institute. So it gives me an opportunity to tell you a little bit about some of the work that's going on there. We now have about 140 members of the Institute, and around half of those are graduate students and half faculty, government scientists, postdocs. We're supporting about 80 people, and we're doing quite a wide range of work, both internationally and nationally. With the Canada Excellence Research Chair as our base funding, we've been able to secure substantial additional funding that I'm not allowed to tell you about. But we do have a large and wide-ranging program. We have a team of people who are excellent and span a whole range of disciplines across the sciences and the social sciences. And of course, we have some important partnerships. So we are based within the National Hydrology Research Centre, and Environment Canada are extremely close partners and engaged in much of our work. And we also have very close partnerships with Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada. And at the provincial level, we have a very strong and formal relationship with the Saskatchewan Water Security Agency. One of the ambitions is to reach out across the university and entrain relevant disciplines to bring the expertise together that we need. And we've been moderately successful in that. And so here's a list of the membership and their various homes, so the major colleges, all of the graduate schools, and a couple of departments that are not represented there, but we've certainly supported students and had very valuable contributions from students within, for example, mathematics and history and law. Our work is broadly based around a set of themes, and those themes have some focal points, which I'll tell you about. So climate change and water security, we're thinking very much about the Saskatchewan River Basin. We're interested in the issues around land and water management, both the urban and the agricultural environments and its effects on water quality, and we're focusing on the South Saskatchewan. We're working on the sustainable development of natural resources. That means working with industries like the oil sands and the mining industries, looking at issues of environmental risk and remediation. And then we have a theme that recognizes the fundamental importance of the social sciences to all of the above, our work in socio-hydrology. And then a little twinkle in our eye, but an area which we're actually active in with projects overseas and also in the north of the province, water and health. There's a huge amount of work going on, and I can't hold you here all evening to tell you about everything we're doing, so I'm going to be selective and just illustrate some of the work that we're doing and a few of the key issues which affect us as a society in Western Canada. So we start off with the Saskatchewan River Basin, about half the size of France, 340,000 square kilometers, home to 3 million people. And of course, the major water resource is the Saskatchewan River, and the major source of that water is the Rocky Mountains. So we live in one of the most extreme and variable climates in the world, extreme in terms of temperatures, temperature ranges, minus 40, plus 40, but also extremes in terms of extreme events, floods and droughts. It's remarkable that in that environment we actually produce 80% of Canada's agricultural production, and Canada is the world's fourth largest exporter of food to the world. We are, a society, fairly rapidly developing, and the province, this province is at the forefront of growth in Canada, as we all know. And so we have a whole series of challenges as we think forward to what futures we want to achieve for our water resources. The basin is interesting not only to us who live there, but also to the world, because there's some real science challenges. And some of these are around the cold region processes that we live with and the rest of the world finds difficult to capture in their models. The Boreal forest, which is 30% of Canada's landmass and a huge biome of global significance, and the prairies, which is an environment that actually we struggle with in terms of understanding how to manage our water, how to predict our flood runoff, and so on. And then we, on top of that, have a whole series of management challenges, and these really encapsulate the problems that we see around the world. So the Saskatchewan River Basin is really emblematic in many senses of the world's water issues. So the South Saskatchewan in southern Alberta has run out of water. We're seeing rapid climate change taking place in the Rocky Mountains, which are the source of 80% of our river flow. We're seeing changes to the prairie environment too. And we're changing our landscape around us in quite subtle ways through the changes that are taking place in agriculture and agricultural land management. We have our problems of pollution, and I'll come back to those issues. We're putting increasing pressure on the water environment. And We also have our challenges in terms of managing our water resources. So the Saskatchewan River Basin is home to 3 provinces. Those provinces have their different legal structures, their individual responsibilities for water management and water quality management. We have federal responsibilities associated with fisheries and oceans and water quality, and we have arguments between the province and the federal government. And we have special needs and responsibilities around water for First Nations and their lands. The Prairies have grown up with a history of drought from the 1850s and the Palliser expedition right the way through to recent history. And the 1999-2001 drought was billed as Canada's most expensive natural disaster. In fact, a list of the top 10 disasters are mostly in the Prairies, some with floods and some associated with droughts. Well, I arrived in Saskatoon in the summer of 2010, and we hit a record rainfall. That took us into saturated conditions, frozen soils over the winter, snow accumulation, snow melt, and the province then had serious flooding, about 40 roads affected, many communities affected, but perhaps not as bad as our neighbours downstream, and Manitoba had really significant challenges associated with runoff from the Red River as well as the Saskatchewan. And of course, on top of that story, then the Souris River received really intense rainfall in the spring, and we had massive flooding from Saskatchewan down into the US. So some of John Pomeroy's work in the Rocky Mountains illustrates the magnitude of temperature changes that we're seeing. So John had a 50th birthday party the other week for Marmot Creek, one of the great experimental sites in Western Canada. And that length of record enables us to say that winter temperatures in December, January, February have increased by 5 degrees centigrade over the last 50 years. That's a huge increase with implications, major implications in terms of the rain-snow balance and the runoff processes that feed our river systems. And then the Winnipeg story, nutrients and the problems of managing nutrients in our landscape, which I'll come back to later on. So this is another Pomeroy story. Agricultural drainage is an issue of some concern and of very polarized opinions. So John and Sherry Westbrook are working down in Smith Creek on the Saskatchewan-Manitoba border with very polarized views in the communities between the agricultural community, who sees the advantages of drainage in terms of production, and conservation groups such as Ducks Unlimited, who argue very strongly for the benefits of retaining as much wetland habitat as we can. And then the overriding issue of global change. So here we're looking at projections of temperature over the 21st century, and those projections are consistent about the magnitude of warming over northern latitudes. It is inevitable that we will see significant temperature rises, and it's inevitable that those will affect our lives, our water, our agriculture. So, those are some of the challenges that we see in the Saskatchewan River Basin. What are we doing about it? Well, one of the things that we have to do is to understand these systems and put some of the world's most advanced instrumentation in place to understand these environments. And we've actually created a very, very large-scale laboratory of the Saskatchewan River Basin. And that is something that's of global importance. It's been recognized now by the World Climate Research Program as a regional project, one of 10 in the world, the only one in North America. So we're focusing on the Rocky Mountains, and although Marmot Creek has been a focus for 50 years, the Rocky Mountains is such an important source that we certainly need to improve our understanding of those processes. So John right now is putting out something like another 20 to 30 meteorological stations so we can better understand the changes in precipitation that are taking place and the runoff processes. The boreal forest is important, And it's perhaps a sad story that Environment Canada has retrenched some of its experimental facilities, and that there's been a lot of publicity in the press this last week about the experimental lakes area, but we have our own experimental sites of global importance in the Boreal forest, the berm sites, which have been providing important data to the global community since 1994. Environment Canada has had to pull back from some of those sites, but we've been fortunate to be able to pick up the slack there and to keep them running and to update and expand their capability. And it's interesting that that NASA have come to us to use this site as one of their experimental sites for satellite-based observation of both soil moisture and also carbon fluxes. The prairies are really important to us, and we've talked about Smith Creek. We're doing a lot of work at St. Denis, just outside town, classic prairie pothole landscape. Kenaston is another important site, Brightwater Creek, the site of another remote sensing experiment involving Canadian Space Agency, NASA, Environment Canada, Guelph, and ourselves. And this is going to be one of the world's most important prairie sites for understanding the hydrology and the interactions between land and atmosphere. We've got some of the first instrumentation of its kind going there in Canada, instrument that uses cosmic ray backscattering to measure soil moisture over quite large areas. We're also looking at the Saskatchewan Delta, and this is one of North America's most important wetland sites, something which is largely out of sight and out of mind, but of crucial importance to the First Nations communities that depend on it for their livelihood. And then turning to water quality, we're putting quite a lot of resource into trying to understand Lake Diefenbaker and its functioning, and some of the other issues associated with chemicals that we're putting into our rivers and lakes. So we have a Saskatchewan River Basin project, part of the World Climate Research Programme. We're aiming to improve our understanding and capability to model and predict changes in the climate, including extremes, these key land surface systems we've just been talking about, the effects of our activities in changing land use and changing land management on both flows and water quality, and then the societal issues that actually underpin the way in which we manage our water and the way in which we need to move forward in developing new strategies and policies for the future. So just a quick run through some of these sites, the Rocky Mountains, John's